Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. We've got a new report challenging the fundamental assumptions of Bill C-12 for NetZero by 2050, legislating the impossible dream.
Influence and power are at play by those demanding a climate accountability law, including the power to economically destroy Canada by the partisan promotion and funding of ideological green and clean tech projects. Recently, 5 Canadian environmental non-governmental organizations, NGOs, most of which are federally registered charities, came together to publish a demand for a climate accountability law in Canada, which would set legally enforceable targets for greenhouse gas GHG emissions reductions. The NGOs are EcoJustice, CANRAC, an organization of more than 100 NGOs, West Coast Environmental Law, Equiterre, Environmental Defense, and Pembina Institute. To appreciate the power and influence of such a collaboration, one should read Robert Lyman's series of reports, reviewing the financial power and new political freedoms of the top 40 NGOs in Canada. Subsequently, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, formerly Eco-Fiscal Commission, Pan-Canadian Collaboration, they issued a report on a similar theme entitled Marking the Way: How Legislating Climate Milestones Clarifies Pathways to Long-Term Goals. The objectives of these groups' demands for climate accountability law would be to force Canadian industry and Canadians to meet the purely voluntary and aspirational targets that are based on the non-scientific claims of the COP21 2015 Paris Agreement. It should be noted that the environmental non-governmental organizations and environmental charities are unelected. They are unaccountable, and some, like World Wild Fund and Greenpeace, are transnational bodies that operate for their own objectives, not those of Canadian taxpayers and citizens. These organizations are greenwashing the public on the obligations of the Paris Agreement, using distorted claims about climate change and misrepresenting the effectiveness of proposed climate mitigations like renewables. It's our view that these groups are acting against the interests of Canadians. So the premise is based on meeting Paris targets. Both reports premise their argument for a Climate Accountability Act by focusing on an apparent need to meet greenhouse gas reduction targets laid out in the Paris Agreement. According to Ottawa energy policy consultant Robert Lyman, who is a former public servant of 27 years and was a diplomat for 10 years, the Paris Agreement is entirely voluntary, it's aspirational, and Canada has no formal obligations to meet those targets. As he writes in his report, Litigating Climate Change in Canada, Canada ratified the Paris Agreement on October 5, 2016. But Canada's treaty obligations under that agreement do not include any requirement that Canada meet any specific GHG emissions reduction target. There's no requirement to pay any penalty if it fails to meet its voluntary emissions reduction targets. There's no requirement to pay any specific amount or share of the collective financing for developing countries. And there's no requirement to use any specific set of policy instruments like taxes, regulations, or subsidies in pursuing Canada's voluntary emissions reductions goals. Consequently, other than creating another burdensome layer of government, populated with more public servants who will be counting carbon dioxide molecules, it's difficult to see why a climate accountability law is required. Canada already has more than 600 different greenhouse gas reduction clean incentive regulations in place today, and Canada's fuel tax is already more than $192 a ton carbon tax equivalent. So this is a questionable purpose that these groups are promoting. Canadians should challenge the fundamental rationale for legislating emissions reduction requirements, because it's clear that no such obligation arises from Canada's political commitments under the 2015 Paris Agreement. Very few other countries that are signatory to the Paris Agreement have imposed upon their citizens such legal obligations, and certainly none of the countries where the most rapid emissions growth is occurring, such as China and India. So what would the real purpose of this law be? Canada does not need a law to establish a target. We've already done that. We do not need a law to establish a pan-Canadian policy framework. We already have that. We do not need a law to establish hundreds of programs. We already have those. And we do not need a law to authorize the Canada-wide carbon dioxide pricing regime. We already have that. We do not need another law to embed climate considerations into the regulatory framework that governs the review of new energy infrastructure projects, because we already have that. And we do not need a law to allow us to maintain records of the progress being made in reducing emissions. We already do that without a law. So what is this really all about? What it means is that the proponents of such a law want to take decisions on climate policy and measures out of the hands of democratically elected governments and place them under the purview of the courts. They want to give environmental lobby groups and their foreign funders an additional weapon to use against the energy producers and users, the ability to challenge in court any new projects of any kind that increase emissions, and thus add enormously to the costs and risks of all new resource developments or new emissions-intensive industrial plants in Canada. In other words, inspired by their ideological commitment to place emissions reduction above all other public policy objectives, they want a way to impose a legal stranglehold on the Canadian economy. This represents a fundamental attack on Canadians' economic freedoms and Canadians' best economic avenue and hope for recovery from the present economic recession. Canada needs to use our natural resources as a powerful lever to grow our income and employment. Canada does not need another weapon that radical environmentalists with deep pockets and crafty lawyers can use against tax-paying workers and the Canadian economy. As Philip Cross wrote of economist Robert Shiller, beware of powerful narratives that contradict the facts, noting that climate change is another powerful narrative fused with celebrity to browbeat the public into accepting poor policies that are harmful to the economy and do little to change the climate. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.